Welcome to Clinical Lab Chat, part of the MedCore Podcast Network. I'm Chris Wolski, Director of Business Intelligence for CLP, and today we'll be talking about how blood-based testing is revolutionizing the diagnosis and treatment of Alzheimer's. I'm joined by Dr. Alessio Travaglia, Director of Translational Science and Neuroscience at the Foundation for the National Institute of Health, or FNIH. As the director, Alessio leads the FNIH's neuroscience programs. He facilitates the advancement and execution of innovative public-private partnerships and collaborates with government, industry, academia, patient advocacy groups, and private sector organizations. Alessio, welcome to Clinical Lab Chat. I'm really excited to talk to you about this really interesting breakthrough here, and I think it's a big one. But before we get into that, why don't we discuss a little bit about why diagnosing Alzheimer's has been so difficult and testing is so invasive. So why has it always been very difficult and terrible? And I think some of our audience probably knows how terrible it is, but if you could just go over why it's been difficult and so invasive.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Yes, you're right. Diagnosing Alzheimer's disease has historically been very challenging, and there are multiple reasons for that, but I'd like to put things into perspective. First, we didn't have definitive biomarkers for many years. So for a long time, I would say 20 plus years, physicians didn't have reliable, accessible biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. So they would heavily rely on clinical assessment, neuropsychological tests, and determine whether a patient has Alzheimer's disease or not. And this is difficult per se. And also, let's keep in mind that memory loss and cognitive impairment are common in many neurological conditions that make the diagnosis even harder. And then
Right.
I would say that about 10 years ago or so, we start having the first biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease, but to measure amyloid plaques and tau tangles that are the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, we need to rely on quite invasive procedure like positron emission tomography or PET scan or CSF analysis, which involves lumbar puncture or spinal tap to measure level of the same protein I mentioned before, amyloid beta and tau protein, and this is quite invasive. And so the development of blood biomarker that are less invasive, more accurate, and accessible is the next logical step of what we've seen in the last 20 years.
Right. Okay. So, and certainly a PET scan, of course, involves drinking the tracer, and then which is not pleasant, and then even less pleasant is getting a lumbar or spinal tap. So certainly people, and there's a lot of expense involved with both those tests as well. So
right, and I would like to add here, since you mentioned, not only is unpleasant and this drinking or injection of radioactive tracer safety concern, and then on top of that, take a really long time to develop these tracers. They can be expensive, and they are not always available in all healthcare settings.
Right. So accessibility. Right. Now we're getting into accessibility, of course. All right. So now we have a blood-based biomarker, and several companies are working on that. And we're just going to talk about the biomarker itself and not individual companies today. So how does blood-based testing for Alzheimer's work? How does that biomarker work? What are they looking for? And what are neurologists and pathologists looking for in that blood test? What is that biomarker marking?
Yeah, so in the last few years, neurologists and pathologists started to look at several markers in the blood. Amyloid beta or A beta proteins, certainly this is the hallmark for Alzheimer's disease. There are these two fragments, 42 and 40, and based on the ratio and the changes in the ratio, this is a hallmark and prediction of how Alzheimer's disease is progressing. So this is the first marker that neurologists and pathologists were looking at. Tau proteins, especially total tau or t-tau or phosphorylated tau, also mentioned as p-tau, And the level of these two markers, and we'll discuss a little bit more about the phosphorylation
Right.
which residues, are two markers that are a key feature of Alzheimer's disease. Then
Mm-hmm.
neurofilament light chain, or NFL, is another protein that is strongly correlated with neural damage and neurodegeneration. Even though this is not specific of Alzheimer's disease, as in common with other neurological conditions, certainly is a marker that gained a lot of traction and interest in the last several years. And last but not least, there are genetic markers starting from ApoE4 genotype or ApoE genotyping in general, and the presence of ApoE4 allele is the strongest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease.
Right. Okay. So we kind of touched on some of the benefits of this because this is just it's a blood test, right? I mean, they're just it's just you're just taking a I imagine it's a venous puncture, and you're just collecting blood and running it through whatever test
Right.
you're using.
Right.
Okay.
But then, the important thing here is that, yes, there are all these blood tests, they're promising, but there is a huge range of variability. There are some
Right.
tests that are accurate and others that are not. There are tests
Right.
that are clinically available and tests that are still in validation stage.
Right.
So, in other words, the widespread use of this blood biomarker for Alzheimer's disease in clinical practice has been strongly limited by the lack of robust data validating the accuracy of these biomarkers. And at the end of the day, a physician needs to know, what should I do now? Which test
Right.
should I trust here? I have all
Right.
these biomarkers. What do I do? And this is why at the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, we develop and launch this head-to-head study to determine which blood test has accuracy good enough
Mm-hmm.
to determine the level of amyloid plaques that could replace this PET tracer as well as the CSF analysis.
Right, right, and there are several benefits with a blood test, and certainly we're at the beginning of this. This is some of these have this is relatively recently discovered. Many of these are identified, but the promise. Let's talk about the promise, maybe. The promise is something a couple things we've touched on: lower costs and better accessibility, and accessibility not just for patients generally, but also accessibility to a test itself, because a PET scan or a lumbar tap, there's small rural hospitals, there even areas in urban areas, you don't have ready access to these kinds of advanced tests. At least a blood draw is a fairly simple procedure. So how will that let's we're going to go off a little broader than what we normally do here, but let's talk about treatment, because testing, and you talked about that, it takes a long time to identify some of these things. How does this help treatment? I mean, what's the promise for helping treatment? Now, we have the promise for testing. You can identify it. But what's the promise for treatment? What does this mean for treating Alzheimer's?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I see a lot of benefit of these biomarkers
Okay.
coming to market and be used by physicians. And let me start with the patient perspective. I do see
Right.
a benefit for patients because this early diagnosis and timely intervention is critical. And we heard for many years that detecting Alzheimer's disease earlier allow an early intervention, and with treatments and lifestyle changes, there is higher chance that this is going to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
Second, we are improving the patient and caregiver experience. I mentioned before that has been really challenging to identify Alzheimer's disease. And imagine that you can simply go to your primary doctor, you do a blood draw, and the physician prescribe which test needs to be done, and you know whether you have Alzheimer's disease or not. This is huge,
Right.
and it offers patients and caregivers and families a clear understanding of what disease they have and what to expect. And
Right.
something that has been discussed in the last several years is we are gearing toward a personalized treatment plans. And we had received approval, I mean, the field had approval of few amyloid drugs in the last few years, and there are many more coming to the pipe, and we're going to get the results of several clinical trials in the next few years. And so having all these biomarkers can help to one, tailor the treatment that these patients are going to receive.
Mm-hmm.
And also we're going to know how the disease is progressing in these individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned at the beginning how this is going to help in terms of accessibility. I mean, we touched base on that, of course, compared to PET and CSF analysis, there is no comparison. But at the end of the day, we need to have pharmaceutical companies to develop these drugs. In order to get an approval for a drug, a trial needs to be successful. And in order to be successful, we need to have the right patients at the right time. And
Right.
so these biomarkers are going to help to select the right patients, ideally in early stage of the disease, and it's going to improve tremendously the chance that the drug is going to be successful.
That's a really great point. There have been times when there have been trials that they had the wrong population. It failed because of inadequate candidates for the whatever that treatment was. So we talked a little bit in our pre-interview. We did a little pre-interview before the recording earlier in the week, and you mentioned something that was really interesting to me, that neurology is kind of where cancer, the understanding of cancer was like 20 years ago. So talk to me a little bit. Where's neurology going with just in general, but also in being able to diagnose, effectively diagnosing neurological conditions? Because there are a lot of neurological conditions, and if they are misdiagnosed, it is. I've done articles many years ago about one such case. If it's misdiagnosed, it can be very traumatizing for the patient and their caregivers. So how is this? How is these blood biomarkers helping to advance neurology?
Right. Here the question is, are we stopping? Is this the end of the
Yeah.
story, these biomarkers that
Right.
we have now, this assay? And the answer is absolutely not. Because as I told you when we first discussed, Alzheimer is now what cancer was 20 years ago. We are at
Right.
the beginning of a golden era for neuroscience with the first
Right.
biomarkers that we could bring to market hopefully soon. But this is not the end of the story. We need to do more research. We have to gear toward a personalized medicine, as I mentioned before.
Right.
And at the end of the day, I think that these biomarkers are really going to help to break the silos. The
Mm.
body
Okay.
doesn't care whether we call it Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, ALS, and ultimately it's not the disease that we're curing, it's the pathology, it's the pathophysiology that we have to address. And so these
Right.
biomarkers are going to help to understand what is the mechanisms that is in common between all these disease, and then we're going to give the right cure at the right patient at the right time.
Right, great. And the other thing I think is interesting, because I was just at the ADLM conference, and we talked a lot about, there's a number of, I think some of the companies that are developing some of the blood based biomarker tests were there, of course, and we were talked about a number of other tests that are coming out for other diseases. And it just seems like we're identifying new biomarkers constantly. And so I just want to back up, maybe just get your thoughts on this. Is that we talked about this in the pre-interview, about how it seems like for 60, 70, 80 years, blood tests were pretty basic. Blood type, and that was about it. And then now we look at genetics, and now we have all these other biomarkers that are coming out. Why is that? Why are we being able to identify all these biomarkers now? And are we in some sort of a new renaissance, as it were, of blood based testing?
Yeah, absolutely. I personally think we are experiencing a golden era for neuroscience and this biomarker work. And I would say
Yeah.
that there are multiple factors that contribute to this rapid advancement in the discovery and validation of new biomarkers. I would say the first is we have a much better understanding of the disease biology. And this is
Mm.
due to advancement in understanding the molecular and cellular mechanisms underlying all these diseases. The second is we have massive advancement in technology and omics, and
Mm.
this
Right.
certainly facilitates the discovery of new biomarkers, and let's say, mass spectrometry allows today to do things that were not imaginable a few years ago. And this includes the precise identification and quantification of proteins, metabolites, and other molecules in blood samples. And let's not forget that bioinformatics, uh, all the artificial
Mm,
intelligence and machine learning that allows enhanced computational analysis and algorithms to analyze large data sets, identifying patterns and potential biomarkers that we have. The last thing that I want to mention is that we do have an increased funding, especially in neuroscience. And as you know, in the last 15 years or so, a lot of companies, biotechs, and pharma walk away from neuroscience. And the reason is
mm,
it was hard. They didn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. We didn't have any biomarker, whereas now we are experiencing this golden era in neuroscience. And the really
yeah.
last thing that I'm seeing that I want to say is that there is there is a strong agreement and consensus that science has the power to cure, but there is no single organization that can do it alone. There is
Right.
a very strong sense of collaboration, working together, which is at the basis of the work done by the FNIH. We working together can cure any disease.
Right. One thing we talked about at the ADLM, I'm wondering if this is also fueling this in a way. There are, I wouldn't say, there aren't cures for Alzheimer's in particular, but there's better treatments. Do you think that's also help? Is that also helping to push the discovery of new diagnostic tests as well? Because that's one thing that I talked with a few people that said that, well, if you don't have a treatment for disease, having a test for it, maybe that's a cynical way of looking at it, but having a test for it is all right. You have the disease. There's not a lot we can do, but now with Alzheimer's in particular, there are things that can be done. I mean, you can't cure it, but it can certainly help to prolong people's lives and have them live a fairly full life and full lifespan now with some of the new, at least some of the drugs and such that are available.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, some people think that having a biomarker without a drug is not useful, but actually it's
Yeah.
not the case. And I would say at least a couple of main reasons. First, if we want to develop drugs, we need to have biomarkers because otherwise
Right.
we do a trial without knowing whether we have the right patient, without knowing whether this is going to work or not. So basically,
Mm-hmm.
we're flipping the coin twice, and we hope that we're
All
going to be
right.
successful. The second thing, even without a drug, there are many risk factors for dementia, and including sleep, cholesterol, exercise, and these were published, the revision of the Lancet Commission, like now we have 14 risk factors for dementia. So even without a drug, there are many things that people can do to decrease the risk to develop Alzheimer's disease.
Right. Right. All right. So let's look ahead a little bit from your perspective. What's next for blood-based testing for Alzheimer's and other neurological diseases? Do you think we're going to be seeing even? Is this just going to start a cascade of discovery of biomarkers? Do you think, or are we going to go in a different diagnostic direction?
Yeah, that's a logical next step that we have to do. I mean, the study that we did comparing the leading biomarker is the first next step. Now we know that
Right.
we have some critical tests and biomarkers that have an accuracy good enough to be in the market soon and to replace CSF and PET scan. We do also know that p-tau 217 needs to be used in an accurate test, and so this is what physician should assess and care the most. But as I mentioned before, Alzheimer is now what cancer was 20 years ago. So this is definitely the time to continue investing in
Yeah.
biomedical research. If we want to get to personalized medicine, we need to have additional biomarkers. And
Right.
to limit to Alzheimer's disease, we need to identify patients early and we need to develop a prognostic biosignature in people that don't have Alzheimer yet, that they are cognitively unimpaired, so their cognition function just fine, but they already have the biology that is going to lead to Alzheimer.
Right.
So
Right.
having this biosignature, identify patients early, is the next thing that we're going to do in the next few years.
Okay, well, great. Well, unfortunately, with that, we've come to the end of our time. Alessio, thanks again for taking the time to share your insights. And really, I think this is really exciting and next steps. I can't wait to see what happens for all of us, for all of our health. And I think that it is very valuable for our clinical lab chat audience. I also want to thank you, the laboratory audience, again for listening. Look for more episodes of Clinical Lab Chat in the future and visit us online at clpmag.com and on all of the major social media platforms. We're on all of them. Until next time, be well.